The Kryax made one fatal mistake, underestimating humanity. The Kryax Dominion had conquered 400 worlds in 11,000 years without ever losing a war, and it had done so through a doctrine of patient certainty that no prior species had ever managed to break. A record so long and so unbroken that the Dominion's own historians in the centuries before Earth had stopped writing about the possibility of defeat at all, treating it as a category of history that simply did not apply to their civilization anymore, the way an old, settled empire might stop teaching its children about famine because famine had not touched its borders in living memory. That doctrine had been carved, quite literally, into the chitin walls of the hive cradle on the homeworld of Kryaxis Prime in characters that glowed faint amber under the black light of the cradle's sacred chambers. Know your enemy before you strike, and strike only when the enemy is already known to be lesser. It was a doctrine built on patience, on the Kryax's own staggering biological advantage, a species of segmented, chitin-plated warriors who matured from larval scout to fully armored soldier in a matter of months rather than years, who could absorb wounds that would kill a softer species outright and keep fighting on nerve clusters distributed so redundantly through their long, jointed bodies that a Kryax warrior could lose 3 of its 6 limbs and still stand. And it was a doctrine that had never once failed them, because in 11,000 years of expansion the Kryax had never encountered a species whose true measure they had gotten wrong. They watched. They studied. They sent scout broods to observe a target civilization for a full generation before committing a single soldier, cataloging weapons, tactics, population densities, psychological profiles, until the target's entire capacity for resistance was understood down to the decimal point, and only then did the Dominion's war broods descend, overwhelming and utterly certain because certainty to the Kryax mind was not arrogance but simple military competence. The natural consequence of a species that never went to war without first knowing, beyond any reasonable doubt, exactly how the war would end. The hive cradle itself, a structure grown rather than built across nearly 1,000 years by the combined biological effort of an entire cast of architect drones bred for the purpose, stood at the center of Kryaxis Prime's capital nest like a vast segmented heart, its chambers lined with the same living chitin that made up every Kryax structure across 400 worlds, warm to the touch, faintly luminescent along seams the Dominion called bloodlines, and it was here, in the deepest chamber of the cradle, that the Dominion's War Council convened, a body of 9 senior strategist drones whose long lives and accumulated caste authority had earned them the right to direct the Dominion's conquests without needing to consult the vast, silent hive mind that bound every lesser Kryax to instant, unquestioning coordination. The Council governed a civilization built on a single, unbroken principle. That certainty was the highest military virtue, that a war worth fighting was a war whose outcome could be calculated in advance to a comfortable margin, and that any conflict which introduced genuine uncertainty into that calculation was, by definition, a conflict the Dominion had prepared for badly rather than a conflict that might simply be unpredictable by its very nature. This principle had served the Dominion across 11,000 years and 400 worlds because every civilization the Kryax had ever encountered, whether it built its societies around monarchic hierarchy or corporate directive or theocratic command, shared with the Kryax themselves some recognizable version of centralized authority, a chain of command that could be mapped, measured, and broken, and it was this unbroken pattern, tested and confirmed 400 times without exception, that made the Council so comfortable authorizing the modest, routine deployment against a small, fractured world at the edge of a spiral arm the Dominion had not yet bothered to fully survey. It was this doctrine, unbroken across 400 conquered worlds, that led the Kryax Dominion to humanity, and it was this doctrine, more than any single battlefield failure, that would ultimately cost the Dominion the only war in its long and undefeated history that it did not win, because the Kryax scout broods who first found Earth made an error so small, so reasonable by every standard the Dominion had ever used to measure a civilization, that it took the Dominion's War Council nearly a full year after the war's end to understand exactly where the doctrine had broken, and by then it no longer mattered, because the mistake had already cost them everything they had built. The first Kryax scout brood to reach Earth's solar system arrived in the outer arc beyond Neptune's orbit in a year that human astronomers would later mark simply as the year of first contact. Though contact was not, strictly speaking, the correct word for what happened, since the scout brood's entire purpose was to observe without being observed. A task that the Kryax, with their long-range sensor arrays and their patient, methodical scouting protocols refined across 11,000 years of conquest, expected to accomplish easily against a civilization that had not yet developed even rudimentary interstellar travel. Vezrat's ninth clutch was, by Kryax standards, an unusually thoughtful drone, one of a rare caste line bred specifically for the patient, methodical work of long-term reconnaissance rather than the more common castes bred for direct combat. And he took a quiet, procedural pride in the thoroughness of his observations, a pride that made him, in the years that followed, one of the few senior Kryax willing to admit, publicly and at some professional cost, exactly where his own reporting had gone wrong. He had spent nearly 3 centuries in Dominion service, had scouted 11 worlds prior to Earth, and had never once had a report contested by the War Council. A record he regarded, in the years before the war, as evidence of his own competence, rather than evidence that he had simply never before scouted a civilization strange enough to break his methodology. His scout brood, numbering some 400 specialized observation drones distributed across a network of cloaked satellites in Earth's outer system, spent the better part of 2 years compiling data on humanity's weapons programs, its industrial output, its political fault lines, cross-referencing every fractious news broadcast and every leaked military document his brood's infiltration specialists could intercept, and every single data point examined individually supported the same conclusion: a species still decades, if not centuries, away from meaningful interstellar capability, divided against itself in ways that would only accelerate its collapse the moment external pressure was applied. Vezrat's error, the one he would spend the rest of his long life examining, was not a failure of data collection, which was, by any objective measure, exhaustive and accurate. It was a failure of interpretation. The quiet, unexamined assumption, so deeply embedded in Kryax military philosophy that it did not even register as an assumption at all, that a species' internal disagreements were necessarily a sign of weakness rather than, as humanity would go on to demonstrate at ruinous cost to the Dominion, a sign of a particular and dangerous kind of strength that simply did not resemble anything the Kryax had ever needed to recognize before. The scout brood commander, a senior drone named Vezrat's Ninth Clutch, whose long service had earned him the rare honor of independent judgment rather than pure hive directive, spent the first several months of observation compiling exactly the kind of report the Dominion's War Council expected. Humanity was a young, single-world species, still burning chemical fuels in low orbit, still fractured into competing political factions that spent as much energy fighting one another as building anything resembling a unified defense. A species with crude nuclear weapons capable of devastating their own world but nothing that could meaningfully threaten a Kryax war brood, no functioning planetary shield technology, no distributed sensor net, no unified military command structure at all. By every metric the Dominion's conquest doctrine had ever used to categorize a target civilization, humanity fell squarely into the category the Kryax called nascent-soft, worlds young enough to lack meaningful defense and fractured enough to lack meaningful will, the easiest and most common category of conquest in the Dominion's long history, requiring the least commitment of resources and the fewest war broods to subjugate. What Vezrat's Ninth Clutch's report did not capture, because the report's entire methodology was built around measuring capability rather than character, was the thing that would eventually undo the Dominion's 400-world winning streak in less than 3 years of open war: humanity's fractiousness, the very trait the Kryax doctrine flagged as a weakness, a sign of a species too disunified to mount coordinated resistance, was in fact the opposite of what it appeared to be from a distance. Humanity's political fractures were not the fractures of a species incapable of unity. They were the ordinary friction of a species that had never needed total unity to survive, because it had never faced an enemy that required it. And beneath that friction ran a substrate of adaptability that the Kryax's rigid hive-directed society had no framework for measuring at all, because the Kryax themselves had never needed to adapt to anything in 11,000 years of unbroken, overwhelming victory. A hive mind that has never lost does not develop the muscle for losing gracefully, does not develop contingency, does not develop the particular creative desperation that a fractured, argumentative, stubborn species develops as a matter of course every single day of its ordinary existence. And this difference, invisible to any sensor array, invisible to any report built around counting weapons and mapping political borders, was the single fatal blind spot in 11,000 years of Kryax conquest doctrine, and it was about to be tested against the one species in the galaxy least suited to confirm the doctrine's assumptions. The Dominion's War Council, upon receiving Vezrach's report, authorized what it considered a modest and entirely proportionate response. A single war brood of 12,000 soldiers carried aboard 3 assault carriers, a force the Council's actuarial priesthood calculated as roughly 40 times the strength required to subjugate a nascent-soft world of humanity's measured capability. A margin so comfortable that the Council did not even bother convening its full War Doctrine Committee to review the deployment, treating it instead as a routine expansion order of the kind the Dominion issued perhaps a dozen times a year across its 400 worlds. The Kryax assault carriers folded into real space above Earth's moon on a clear morning in the northern hemisphere. 3 vast vessels of black chitin-plated hull grown rather than built, their surfaces ridged and segmented like the exoskeletons of the warriors they carried, pulsing with a dim, pulsing bioluminescence that ran along seams the Kryax called bloodlines, and Vezrach Ninth Clutch standing in the lead carrier's command chamber. A cavernous space lined with the same chitin architecture as every Kryax structure, its walls faintly moist and faintly warm in the way of all Kryax construction, gave the order to begin the Dominion's 401st conquest with the same calm, procedural confidence that had accompanied the previous 400. Humanity's response to the sudden appearance of 3 vast alien vessels above the moon was not, in that first hour, the response of a unified species with a coordinated defense doctrine, because humanity did not have one, had never needed one, had spent its entire recorded history assuming that if first contact ever came it would arrive with decades of warning through slow radio signals, rather than 3 warships appearing without notice in cislunar space. What humanity's response was, instead, was something the Kryax doctrine had never encountered in 11,000 years, and had no adequate name for. A species so instinctively argumentative, so used to disagreeing internally about absolutely everything, that within 6 hours of the carrier's arrival, a dozen separate national governments, 3 competing private orbital defense contractors, an international space agency coalition, and no fewer than 4 rogue military commanders who decided the chain of command had effectively dissolved and they would simply act on their own initiative, had all independently begun taking uncoordinated, contradictory, and in several cases actively counterproductive action, launching everything from formal diplomatic hailing attempts to unauthorized missile strikes to a private orbital mining company's decision to simply open fire with a repurposed asteroid deflection laser because its owner, a blunt and profoundly undiplomatic man named Oceano Marsh, decided that waiting for permission from any of the 12 governments currently arguing about jurisdiction was a luxury the situation did not afford. In Geneva, an emergency session of the fractured International Security Council convened within the first 2 hours, and accomplished, in the words of one exhausted delegate who would later become a minor celebrity for the blunt honesty of her private diary entries, absolutely nothing beyond 3 hours of procedural argument over whose jurisdiction the response even fell under, a delay that would have been fatal against any enemy that required a unified answer within that window. but which turned out to matter far less than anyone in that chamber could have predicted, because while the diplomats argued, a retired submarine commander in the Pacific named Hiroshi Tanaka, watching the news feeds from his small coastal home, simply gathered 11 former crewmates through a group messaging chain and began, without waiting for any government's authorization, planning how a decommissioned but still functional attack submarine, one that a defense contractor had forgotten to properly decommission and that Tanaka happened to know the access codes for, might be used to shadow and track the alien vessel's descent patterns. In Lagos, a university physics department locked its doors and simply kept working through the chaos. 3 professors and a dozen graduate students pooling every scrap of data from public satellite feeds to build the first crude model of the invader's hull composition, a model that would prove invaluable to materials scientists 6 months later, though none of the students building it in that first chaotic week had any formal authority to be doing so at all. In a suburb outside Chicago, a teenager who had spent years building an amateur radio network with friends across 4 continents used that network, entirely without government sanction, to relay early warning data between cities faster than any official channel could manage, because the official channels were still arguing about which agency owned the responsibility for early warning in the first place. None of these efforts were coordinated with one another. None of them had been ordered by any government, corporation, or military command, and every single one of them in the weeks and months that followed turned out to matter, contributing some small, unplanned piece to a resistance that no central authority could have designed on purpose, because no central authority, human or Kryax, had ever needed to plan for a defense built entirely from 1,000 individuals simply refusing to wait for permission. Vesrach Ninth Clutch, watching this chaotic, uncoordinated human response unfold across his carrier's sensor arrays, filed it. In the last comm assessment the Dominion's doctrine would ever get right about humanity, as further confirmation of the nascent-soft classification, a species so disorganized it could not even manage a coherent first response to an existential threat, exactly the kind of target the Dominion's conquest formula was built to exploit. What he did not understand, what the doctrine had no capacity to make him understand, was that this uncoordinated chaos was not evidence of a species too weak to resist. It was the visible surface of a species that solved problems through parallel, redundant, wildly experimental effort rather than centralized directive. A species that had built its entire civilization, its science, its art, its industry, through the accumulated friction of millions of disagreeing individuals all pulling in slightly different directions, until, more often than the Kryax hive mind could ever conceive of, one of those directions turned out to be exactly right. Oceano Marsh's unauthorized laser strike, fired in blunt, undiplomatic frustration at a moment when every government on Earth was still debating protocol, happened to catch one of the 3 Kryax carriers' secondary sensor arrays at an angle its ablative plating had not been designed to deflect. And while the strike did no meaningful structural damage, it blinded a portion of that carrier's short-range detection grid for nearly 11 hours, a small, accidental wound inflicted by a single stubborn man acting entirely on his own initiative, the kind of contribution the Kryax's rigid hive command structure, in which no drone below a certain caste acted without explicit directive, could never have produced, and it was the first small crack in a doctrine that had never before needed to account for the strange military value of a species that simply would not wait to be told what to do. The Kryax landed their first war brood not in a single decisive strike, but across a dozen separate points on Earth's surface, following the same doctrine that had subjugated 400 worlds before. Overwhelming local force applied simultaneously across multiple population centers, designed to shatter any coordinated resistance before it could organize. A tactic that worked with brutal efficiency against every prior nascent-soft world the Dominion had ever conquered. Worlds where local defense, once broken, tended to collapse entirely because those civilizations' military structures were centralized enough that breaking the center broke the whole. Humanity's military structures were not centralized in that way. had never been, and the Kryax warbrood commanders on the ground discovered, within the first 72 hours of the invasion, a species that responded to the shattering of any single point of resistance, not with collapse, but with a kind of stubborn, decentralized reconstitution that the Dominion's tactical manuals had no chapter for. Local commanders who had lost contact with national command simply continuing to fight on their own initiative, civilian populations organizing improvised resistance networks within hours of a city's fall. Engineers and hobbyists and retired soldiers and teenagers with more courage than sense contributing pieces of tactics and technology that no single command structure had ordered, but that nonetheless in aggregate began to accumulate into something the Kryax War Council. Reviewing the first week's casualty reports with the first genuine alarm the Dominion had felt in centuries, could only describe as an enemy that refused to stay defeated in the places it had already, by every metric the Dominion trusted, been defeated. The landings themselves, when they came 6 days after the carrier's arrival, were conducted with the same procedural confidence that had characterized every prior Kryax conquest. Drop pods of grown chitin descending in 12 simultaneous strikes across population centers on 4 continents, each pod disgorging a full company of Kryax infantry. 6-limbed warriors in segmented natural armor-wielding weapons that fired superheated plasma bolts capable of punching through most conventional military vehicles in a single strike. Weapons that had ended every prior nascent-soft world's organized resistance within the first 72 hours of ground contact. The initial engagements followed the pattern the Dominion expected almost exactly. Local military garrisons, caught without adequate warning or coordination, fell within hours in most of the 12 strike zones. National command structures fractured under the psychological weight of an enemy whose armor and weapons rendered most conventional defenses meaningless. And by the end of the first week, the Dominion's field commanders were filing reports that matched Vezrach's original assessment almost point for point, 12 population centers effectively pacified. Resistance scattered and disorganized, exactly the outcome 400 prior conquests had trained the Kryax to expect. What those same field reports did not adequately capture, buried as they were in the confident procedural language of a species that had never needed to look closely at the exception rather than the rule, was the growing list of small, isolated incidents that did not fit the pattern at all. A Kryax patrol ambushed in a collapsed subway tunnel by a group of transit workers, armed with nothing more sophisticated than improvised thermite charges, and an intimate knowledge of the tunnel network no alien sensor had bothered to map in sufficient detail. A Kryax drop pod destroyed on its final approach by a decommissioned anti-aircraft battery that a museum curator and 2 retired veterans had gotten running again out of nothing but stubbornness, and spare parts scavenged from a static display. A company of Kryax infantry that advanced confidently into what their scans indicated was an undefended agricultural district, and instead found themselves fighting for 6 hours against a militia of farmers who had spent generations hunting dangerous wildlife with hunting rifles and knew, in ways no formal military doctrine could teach, exactly how to use terrain and patience against a superior force. It took the Kryax High Command 4 months to fully commit to what became known, in both human and Kryax military histories, as the true war rather than the initial conquest action, 4 months in which the Dominion's War Council, increasingly uneasy at reports that did not match Vezrach Ninth Clutch's original assessment, authorized successive reinforcements, first doubling the original warbrood, then tripling it. Then committing an entire Dominion battle fleet of 90 warships and over 200,000 soldiers, a commitment of force that the Dominion had not made against a single world in over 3,000 years, since the last time it had encountered a civilization stubborn enough to require it. And even this commitment, the War Council told itself in the same calm, procedural language it had used to authorize the original modest deployment. was merely a matter of applying sufficient force to correct what it still, even 4 months in, insisted on describing as an unusually persistent but ultimately doomed resistance from a nascent-soft world. Because the doctrine that had never failed in 11,000 years was not a thing the Dominion's command structure found easy to question, not even in the face of mounting evidence that something about this particular conquest did not fit the pattern at all. The Dominion's War Council authorized these successive reinforcements not out of any dawning recognition that its original doctrine had failed, but through a series of small, individually reasonable escalations that, taken together, represented a commitment far beyond anything the Council would have approved if presented with the full picture at once, a pattern that several Kryax historians would later identify as a second, subtler failure of the Dominion's rigid hierarchy. A war council so accustomed to trusting the procedural confidence of its own doctrine that it kept authorizing one more increment of force, certain each time that this increment would surely be the one that restored the expected outcome, rather than stepping back to ask whether the doctrine itself might be the thing failing. Each individual escalation was debated and approved by drones who had never questioned the fundamental soundness of the conquest formula that had won 400 prior wars, and each one arrived on the battlefield only to discover that the human resistance had, in the intervening months, simply grown more capable than the Rian fork. Lament had been sized to overcome, a mismatch that widened rather than narrowed with every subsequent commitment, because humanity's improvised innovations compounded and accelerated in ways that the Dominion's static, doctrine-bound planning simply could not anticipate or match. What humanity built in those 4 months and in the 18 months of open war that followed was not a single miracle weapon or a single decisive tactic, because humanity, true to its nature, did not solve problems that way. It was instead an accumulation of 1,000 small, stubborn innovations, each one contributed by some fractious, disagreeing corner of a species that had never needed central coordination to be dangerous. In a reclaimed mountain valley that had briefly fallen under Kryax control before a scrappy, poorly supplied militia retook it through sheer nighttime persistence, a chemist who had once taught high school science before the war began experimenting with modified incendiary compounds derived from common agricultural fertilizer, producing, after months of dangerous trial and error that cost her 2 fingers and very nearly her life, a weapon crude enough that any properly funded military research program would have dismissed it as unworthy of serious development, and effective enough against Kryax chitin plating at close range that it became standard issue for irregular units within a year, spreading through informal manufacturing networks that no single government ever formally sanctioned or funded. In a coastal fishing community that lost half its able-bodied population in the war's first winter, the survivors, mostly older fishers and their teenage children, adapted their small fleet's sonar and net deployment systems into a crude but effective coastal early warning network that gave 3 separate cities enough warning to evacuate civilians before Kryax strikes that would otherwise have caught them entirely unprepared. An innovation born entirely from people who had never served in any military applying the only expertise they had, the patient, practical knowledge of reading water and weather, to a problem no admiralty had thought to ask fishers about. In dozens of universities that managed to keep some fragment of their research infrastructure running through the war's worst years, students and professors who had no formal military assignment at all simply kept working on whatever problems seemed most urgent to them individually, producing a scattered, uneven, but cumulatively enormous body of applied research, communications encryption breakthroughs from a cryptography seminar that had nothing to do with any official war effort, improved battery chemistry from a materials science lab pursuing what its members initially thought was purely civilian research, medical advances in treating plasma burn injuries developed by trauma surgeons working from first principles, because no textbook anywhere described wounds like the ones the war was now producing by the thousand. Civilian engineers in a dozen countries, working independently and often unaware of one another's progress, began reverse engineering fragments of downed Kryax technology, chitin plating samples and disabled weapon systems recovered from the wreckage of the Warbrood's early overconfident ground assaults, assaults that the Kryax's own doctrine, built around the assumption of minimal resistance, had conducted with far less caution than the Dominion would ever again permit itself against any species. A materials scientist in what had once been a mid-sized industrial nation, working from salvaged Kryax chitin analogs, developed a composite armor plating within 8 months that human industry, still scrambling and improvised, nonetheless began mass-producing within another 6. Plating that could shrug off the Kryax's standard infantry weapons in a way the Dominion's own doctrine, built on the assumption that nascent-soft worlds never developed adequate countermeasures within the conquest timeline, had never planned for. A coalition of orbital engineers, cobbling together satellite platforms from 3 different nations' fractured space programs, because none of those nations could agree on a single unified command structure, and all of them decided independently that waiting for agreement was a luxury the war did not afford, built humanity's first orbital defense grid within a year, a patchwork inelegant, thoroughly human system stitched together from incompatible components that should not have worked as well together as they did, and worked anyway, because the engineers building it cared more about results than elegance. The single innovation that would ultimately break the Kryax war effort, though, came not from a government laboratory or a military research program, but from the same kind of blunt, undiplomatic, individually motivated stubbornness that had produced Oceano Marsh's accidental laser strike in the war's opening hours. And at sea. Aim from a woman named Naledi Akonkwarez, a former combat engineer turned resistance fighter who had lost her entire family in the fall of her home city during the war's second month, and who spent the following year not seeking revenge in any conventional sense, but obsessively studying the one thing about Kryax biology that the Dominion's own doctrine, built on 11,000 years of unbroken confidence, had never needed to consider vulnerable. The hive mind communication network that bound every Kryax soldier to a caste hierarchy above it, a biological and technological system that allowed Kryax warbroods to coordinate with a speed and precision no individually commanded human unit could match, but which also meant, as Naledi discovered through months of painstaking analysis of captured communication relays, that a sufficiently disruptive signal, tuned to the exact resonance of the hive network's coordination frequency, could not simply jam Kryax communications the way conventional jamming disrupted human radio, but could actually induce a cascading confusion in the lower caste soldiers who depended entirely on hive directive to function, soldiers who, stripped of the constant stream of caste authority guidance they had never in their species' history needed to operate without, would simply freeze, disoriented and directionless, unable to independently decide what to do next in a way that no human soldier, trained from childhood in a fractious, individually willed society to act on their own judgment when orders failed, would ever have been vulnerable to in the same way. Naledi Akonkwarez had been, before the war, an unremarkable combat engineer serving in a peacekeeping deployment far from home, the kind of career soldier who filled out paperwork and maintained bridge crossings and had never expected to fight in anything resembling a real war, and the fall of her home city in the invasion's second month, an event she watched unfold in fragmented, agonizing pieces through intermittent communication with family members whose messages simply stopped arriving one by one over the course of a single terrible afternoon, transformed her, in the space of that one day, into someone entirely different from the person she had been the week before. She did not, in the aftermath, seek out a resistance cell for comradeship or vengeance in any dramatic sense. She simply began, alone at first, in a basement workshop she built from salvaged electronics and stubborn refusal to accept that grief meant helplessness, taking apart every fragment of captured Kryax technology she could get her hands on, working 18-hour days on nothing but bitter coffee substitute, and a discipline that former colleagues would later describe as almost frightening in its intensity. She was not by training a communications specialist or a xenobiologist, and the fact that she was the one to eventually crack the Kryax Hive network's vulnerability was, by her own later admission, as much a matter of stubborn persistence as any particular genius, the product of thousands of hours spent doing the unglamorous, repetitive work of mapping signal patterns in captured relay hardware that more credentialed researchers, working within official channels still tangled in bureaucratic caution, had deprioritized in favor of more conventional weapons research. It was Naledi, working essentially alone for the first 8 months, who first noticed that captured Kryax relay hardware carried a constant low-level signal even when the unit's primary combat functions were completely inert. A signal she initially assumed was simply background noise until months of patient analysis revealed it carried a structure, a rhythm. Something that behaved less like a communications channel in the human sense, and more like a nervous system extended outward through technology. A discovery that led her eventually to a team of volunteer researchers who joined her small operation one by one as word of her progress spread through the same informal, decentralized networks that had carried Hiroshi Tanaka's submarine plans and the Lagos Physics Department's hull models. An entire resistance research effort assembled not by any government directive, but by the same stubborn, individually motivated initiative that characterized every piece of humanity's improvised defense. Naledi's discovery, refined over another 6 months of testing and failure in a hidden underground laboratory built from salvaged parts and stubborn improvisation, became the foundation of what human forces began calling the Hush, a network of disruptor arrays deployed at key strategic points that could, for a critical window of several minutes at a time, silence the Hive coordination signal across an entire battlefield. And it was the Hush, more than any single weapon or any single battle, that turned the tide of the war in the 16th month of open conflict, during the engagement that human histories woo. LD come to call the stand at the Calgary line, when a Kryax battle brood of nearly 40,000 soldiers, advancing across the reconstructed defenses of what had once been a mining region in the southern hemisphere, found its entire coordinated assault collapsing into disoriented, leaderless confusion in the critical opening minutes of the engagement, lower caste soldiers standing frozen or wandering in directionless clusters while human forces dug into positions reinforced with the salvaged chitin composite armor that a dozen independent research efforts had spent a year perfecting, advanced with a coordination that came not from any single Hive directive, but from something the Kryax had never learned to fight against because they had never needed to. Individual human soldiers, trained to act on their own initiative when command broke down, making 1,000 small independent decisions that nonetheless in aggregate produced exactly the kind of devastating, adaptive assault that the Dominion's rigid doctrine, built around a species that had never once needed to function without central direction, simply could not answer. To understand why Naledi's discovery would prove so devastating, it helps to understand what the Kryax Hive network actually was, a thing no human researcher fully grasped until long after the war's end, when captive Kryax biologists in the cautious early years of peace finally consented to explain it to human counterparts in exchange for reciprocal knowledge about human neurology that the Dominion found equally baffling. Every Kryax warrior, from the moment it emerged from its larval casing, carried a specialized neural structure at the base of its primary ganglion cluster that bonded, through a combination of biological and technological interface, to the broader caste hierarchy above it, a structure that had evolved over tens of thousands of years of Kryax natural history long before the species ever achieved spaceflight. As an adaptation to the brutal predator ecology of Kryaxis Prime's ancient supercontinent, where solitary Kryax proto-insects had proven vulnerable to apex predators that no individual could survive alone, but that a coordinated swarm, moving with instantaneous, unified purpose, could overwhelm. This adaptation had served the species magnificently across its evolutionary history and had been refined across the millennia of Kryax civilization into the technological hive network that now bound every Dominion soldier to instant coordination with its caste superiors. A system so deeply integrated into Kryax biology that lower caste soldiers, the ones bred and trained purely for infantry combat rather than the rarer independent judgment castes like Vezrach's own scouting line, had never in their species' long history needed to develop the neural pathways for sustained independent decision-making at all, because the hive network had always, without exception, provided that decision-making for them. It was, in the most literal biological sense, not a communication system layered on top of an otherwise independent mind, but a core component of how the majority of Kryax soldiers' minds functioned at all, which meant that disrupting it did not merely cut off information. The way jamming a human radio channel might leave a human soldier isolated but still capable of independent thought and action. It meant, for the vast majority of Kryax infantry, something closer to a sudden and total cognitive vertigo. A soldier whose entire evolutionary and developmental history had never once required it to decide, on its own authority, what to do next, suddenly finding itself required to do exactly that, with no practice, no trained pathway, and often in the field, no time to develop one before the battle around it had already been lost. The battle itself began, in the accounts of the human soldiers who survived it, with a silence that felt almost sacrilegious after 16 months of a war defined by constant grinding noise, the deep bass thrum of Kryax plasma weapons and the answering crack of human artillery falling away in the space of a few heartbeats, into something that felt less like the absence of sound, and more like the absence of a held breath the whole battlefield had been unconsciously taking. Ruth H. Terberg, in the years after the war, was often asked by young officers and by curious journalists what she had felt in the moment she gave the order to advance at Kalgoorlie, whether it had been triumph or fear or some cold tactical calculation, and she always gave the same answer, delivered with the same wry, exhausted honesty that had made her something of a reluctant folk hero in the years after the peace. That she had felt more than anything else, the simple, ordinary certainty of someone who had spent 16 months learning her enemies' patterns well enough to recognize the one moment they finally broke, and that there had been nothing mystical or heroic about it at all, only the accumulated weight of 1,000 smaller lessons, most of them paid for in the lives of soldiers she had trained and buried, finally arriving all at once in a single decisive window that she was simply ready, by hard and bitter experience, to use. A field commander named Ruth H. Terberg, who had lost most of her original unit in the war's second year, and had spent the following months training replacements in tactics that existed nowhere in any official manual, because she had invented most of them herself out of necessity, watched through field glasses as the advancing wall of Kryax infantry, 40,000 strong, arranged in the same disciplined, overwhelming formation that had broken every prior human defensive line, simply stopped moving with purpose, individual soldiers within the formation beginning to drift, to turn in place, to stand motionless in ways that no combat doctrine on either side of the war had ever described, six-limbed warriors who moments before had advanced with terrifying, unified precision, now standing scattered and directionless across open ground like a candle flame guttering in a draught it could neither see nor fight. Uchterberg gave the order to advance not because any manual told her the moment was right, but because she had spent 16 months learning to trust the particular, hard-won instinct that told her exactly when an enemy's hesitation had become an opening. And the human forces that moved forward in that moment did not move as a single coordinated machine, the way the Kryax formation had always moved, but as hundreds of small independent units. Squads and even individual soldiers making their own tactical decisions in real time, flowing around obstacles and confused enemy clusters with an adaptive improvisational speed that no rigid hierarchy, Kryax or otherwise, could have matched. Because there was no single decision being made that an enemy could anticipate and counter. There were 1,000 decisions being made simultaneously by 1,000 different minds, each one small and individually unremarkable. and together overwhelming in a way that felt, to the handful of surviving Kryax officers who later gave testimony in the peace negotiations, less like losing a battle and more like watching the ground itself turn hostile in 100 places at once. By the time the hush's effect faded, some 11 minutes after Naledi's disruptor arrays first activated, the Kryax battle brood's cohesion had already broken past the point where any hive directive, however swiftly restored, could reassemble it in time, and the soldiers who regained their coordination found themselves scattered, flanked, and in many cases already overrun by human units that had used those 11 minutes with a ruthless, practiced efficiency born of 16 months learning exactly how to make an opening count. It was not, in the end, a battle won through superior firepower or superior numbers, since the Kryax battle brood outnumbered and outgunned the defenders at Calgary by a considerable margin, even accounting for the year of improvised human rearmament, but a battle won through the simple, devastating fact that for 11 critical minutes, one side had continued to think and the other had not, and 11 minutes, it turned out, across a battlefield of that scale was more than enough. The Kryax War Council, receiving reports of the Calgary Line disaster alongside a rapidly accumulating list of similar defeats across a dozen other fronts, finally convened the full War Doctrine Committee that it should have convened before the very first deployment. And it was in this session, 18 months into a war the Dominion had originally budgeted 4 months to win, that the Council's most senior strategist, an ancient drone named Kesseth Voidclutch, who had studied every one of the Dominion's 400 prior conquests in exhaustive detail, finally articulated the error that Vezrach Ninth Clutch's original scouting report, and every subsequent reinforcement decision built upon it, had made from the very first assessment. The Dominion's entire conquest doctrine measured a target civilization's capability, its weapons and its industry and its population, but had never once needed to measure a target civilization's character, because in 11,000 years of conquering worlds whose societies were built, in one form or another, around some version of centralized hierarchy not unlike the Kryax's own hive structure, capability and character had always aligned closely enough that measuring one was sufficient to predict the other. Humanity was the first civilization the Dominion had ever encountered whose fundamental social architecture bore no meaningful resemblance to the Kryax's own, a species organized not around hierarchy and directive, but around argument and individual initiative and a stubborn, decentralized refusal to stop simply because the center had been broken, and no rapport. Built around counting missiles and mapping political borders could ever have captured that difference, because that difference did not live in humanity's weapons or its industry. It lived in the simple, ordinary fact that when a human soldier lost contact with command, that soldier did not freeze, did not wait for directive, but simply decided on their own authority and often against their own training what needed to be done next and did it. By the war's final year, the Dominion's 90-warship battle fleet, once the largest single military commitment the Kryax had made in 3,000 years, had been worn down to less than a third its original strength, not through any single decisive human victory, but through the same slow, grinding accumulation of 1,000 small defeats that had characterized humanity's entire response to the invasion. Each one contributed by some different fractious corner of a species. The Dominion had never learned how to fight because it had never learned how to predict what any given human, freed of central command, might independently decide to try. The Kryax soldiers who had once conquered 400 worlds with calm, procedural confidence began, for the first time in the Dominion's recorded history, to experience something the hive mind had no biological framework for processing efficiently. A battlefield in which the enemy's next move could not be predicted from any known doctrine because the enemy was not following a doctrine at all, was instead improvising moment to moment, with a creative desperation the Kryax's own unbroken winning streak had never forced them to develop. Vezrach Ninth Clutch, still in nominal command of the invasion though increasingly overruled by the War Council's panicked reinforcement orders, would later record, In the last report he filed before his own carrier was lost in the war's final major engagement, that he had come to believe the Dominion's original error was not tactical but philosophical, that the Kryax had spent 11,000 years mistaking their own unbroken success for proof that their way of organizing a society was simply correct, and had never developed the imaginative capacity to recognize that a species built along an entirely different architecture might be not lesser, but simply, dangerously, differently capable in ways the Dominion's doctrine had no vocabulary to describe. The war's final engagement, the Battle of the Ashfall Coast, fought in the 29th month of open conflict along a stretch of scorched coastline that had once been farmland before the war reduced it to slag and cinder, was not in the end a battle the Kryax lost through any single catastrophic error, but through the same accumulated weight of humanity's decentralized adaptability that had characterized every engagement before it. Magnified now by 2.5 years of continuous improvement across 1,000 independent human efforts that had, by this point in the war, coalesced into something that finally began to resemble genuine coordination, not because any single command structure had imposed it, but because humanity's fractious innovations had simply had enough time to find each other, to combine, to reinforce. The salvaged chitin armor plating now standard across every human unit. The Hush disruptor network now deployed at every major front. The parallel, independently developed orbital defense grids now finally linked, however imperfectly, into something that could contest Kryax control of near-Earth space for the first time in the war. The Kryax fleet that engaged human orbital forces above the Ashfall coast that final morning, a force of 26 remaining warships representing nearly the entirety of what remained of the Dominion's original 90-ship commitment, moved into engagement range with a caution that would have been unrecognizable to the confident, procedural commanders of the war's opening months. Ships that had once approached a nascent-soft world with the calm certainty of a mathematical proof now advancing in staggered defensive formations, their commanders acutely aware, in a way the Dominion's doctrine had never before required its officers to be aware, that the enemy below them might do something no simulation had predicted. Admiral Cast Commander Threxa Voidborn, who had taken overall command of the remaining fleet after the deaths of 3 more senior officers in the previous month's engagements, had spent the weeks before Ashfall studying every human tactical innovation the Dominion's intelligence network could catalog: the Hush disruptors, the salvaged chitin armor, the improvised orbital defense grid. In a belated and genuinely earnest effort to do the thing Vezrach's original scouting mission should have done from the start, understand the enemy rather than simply measure it, and it was this earnest effort, arriving 18 months too late to change the war's fundamental trajectory, that nonetheless made Rexa the most dangerous Kryax commander humanity had yet faced. A Kryax genuinely trying, for the first time in the war, to think the way the Kryax hive-mind culture had never trained any of its officers to think adaptively, uncertainly, without the comfort of a doctrine that had already worked 400 times before. It was not enough. Threxa's fleet, engaging the patchwork human orbital grid at the same moment ground forces along the Ashfall coast, triggered a Hush deployment timed with a precision that 18 months of brutal, iterative combat experience had finally made possible, found itself fighting not the disorganized defense its own improved intelligence had prepared it for, but a defense that had, through 2.5 years of humanity's fractious, parallel innovation finally arriving at something resembling genuine synthesis. A defense grid built from a dozen incompatible national systems that nonetheless, through the same stubborn human habit of simply making things work together regardless of whether they were designed to, coordinated well enough to contest the Kryax fleet's control of near-Earth space for the first time in the entire war. Human interceptor craft, faster and more maneuverable than the standard designs of the war's early months, because a coalition of aerospace engineers scattered across 3 continents had spent 2 years refining them through the same decentralized argumentative process that had produced every other human innovation in the war. closed with the Kryax formation in numbers that Threxa's own scouts had underestimated by nearly a third, because human industrial production, dispersed across thousands of small, independent facilities that no single Kryax strike could ever hope to fully map or destroy, had simply outpaced anything the Dominion's own intelligence apparatus had believed possible from a nascent-soft world less than 3 years into a war of survival. Threxa Voidborn's flagship took critical damage in the battle's second hour, a strike from a salvaged and heavily modified human orbital laser platform, built from technology the Kryax themselves had unknowingly provided in the war's opening months, that punched through shielding the Dominion's naval architects had considered adequate against anything a nascent-soft world could conceivably produce, and the Admiral. In the last transmission she sent before her vessel was forced to withdraw from the engagement entirely, recorded a single line that Kryax military historians would study for generations afterward. That she had, for the first time in her 300-year career, fought an enemy she could not finish predicting even as the battle ended, and that she suspected, watching her fleet break into a retreat that the Dominion's War Council would soon confirm as the Dominion's first outright defeat in 11,000 years, that no Kryax doctrine yet written contained the tools to finish that prediction at all. The peace that followed, negotiated over the subsequent 2 years through channels that remained tense and mutually suspicious on both sides, was not the peace of a conquered world accepting terms from its conqueror, because humanity had not been conquered, but the peace of two civilizations that had each, in their own way, learned something neither had expected to learn about the other. The initial negotiations, conducted in a series of tense, carefully staged meetings aboard a neutral orbital platform that both sides had insisted on building fresh rather than trust to the other's construction, were complicated from the start by the same fractious quality that had defined humanity's entire war effort: a dozen separate human delegations, representing nations and coalitions that had fought the war with wildly uneven contributions and wildly different casualties. Arriving at the table with contradictory demands and competing visions for what peace should even look like. A chaos that the Kryax delegation, still adjusting to the idea that this species negotiated the way it fought, without any single authoritative voice, found by turns baffling, and in the private assessment Threxa Voidborn recorded for the Dominion's archives after her recovery from the injuries sustained at Ashfall oddly reassuring. A confirmation that whatever had defeated the Dominion's fleet was not some hidden centralized mastermind humanity had been concealing all along, but simply the species itself, exactly as disorganized and exactly as dangerous as it had always been. Kesith Voidclutch, promoted in the war's aftermath to a position of unprecedented influence within the Dominion's war doctrine, committee specifically because of the clarity with which she had identified the Dominion's fatal blind spot, spent the following decade arguing against considerable resistance from a hive-mind culture that did not easily absorb the idea that its own social architecture might be a liability rather than a strength, that the Domi. Neon's 400 worlds of unbroken victory had taught it everything about how to defeat centralized, hierarchical civilizations, and nothing at all about civilizations built on argument, initiative, and decentralized stubbornness. Her arguments were not universally welcomed within the Hive cradle. A substantial faction of the War Doctrine Committee, including several drones who had served alongside Vezrach Ninth Clutch in the war's early planning stages, argued instead that the defeat at Earth was an aberration, a single unlucky encounter with an unusually adaptable species, rather than evidence of any fundamental flaw in 11,000 years of proven doctrine, and it took the independent testimony of no fewer than 6 surviving field commanders, each describing some version of the same disorienting experience of fighting an enemy that could not be predicted from any existing manual, before the committee finally, grudgingly, authorized the first systematic revision of Kryax conquest doctrine in the Dominion's recorded history. A revision that would take the better part of a generation to implement fully, and that some Kryax traditionalists, even decades later, continued to quietly resist. Vezrach Ninth Clutch himself did not live to see the peace fully settled, having been lost in the war's final major engagement, his carrier destroyed in a human counterstrike during the retreat from the Ashfall coast. But the final report he filed, transmitted in the last hours before his ship's destruction, would be studied by Kryax officers for generations afterward as the single clearest articulation of the Dominion's error. A document that ancient hive culture traditionally treated with reverence closer to scripture than to ordinary military reporting, precisely because it had come from a drone whose entire life's work, 3 centuries of patient, methodical scouting service, had been quietly and irrevocably undone by a species he had genuinely, thoroughly studied and still fundamentally misunderstood. Not through any failure of diligence, but through a failure of imagination so deeply embedded in his own biology and culture that he had needed to lose everything to finally see it clearly. Humanity, for its part, emerged from the war fundamentally changed in ways that would shape its trajectory for generations, not unified into the single coherent government that some had hoped the crisis might finally produce, because humanity's essential fractiousness proved, in the end, too deeply rooted to be dissolved even by an existential war, but bound together nonetheless by something new. A hard-won, battle-tested confidence in the particular strength of its own chaotic, argumentative, individually willed nature. A recognition, spoken aloud in 100 different languages across 100 different reconstructed cities, that the very qualities the Kryax Dominion had once measured as weakness, disagreement, decentralization, the stubborn refusal of any single human to simply wait for permission before acting on their own judgment, were in fact the deepest source of the species' survival, and that this quality, so easily mistaken from the outside for disorganization, was in truth the very thing that let humanity adapt faster than any hierarchy could plan against, improvise faster than any doctrine could predict, and ultimately outlast a conquering fleet that had never once in 11,000 years needed to learn how to fight an enemy that simply refused to stop making its own decisions. In the years that followed, as humanity began, cautiously and on its own considerable terms, to rebuild contact with a wider galaxy that had watched the war with a mixture of alarm and grudging fascination, the story of the Kryax Dominion's single fatal mistake became something closer to legend than history, told and retold with the particular relish humanity reserved for stories of being underestimated and proving the underestimation wrong, and it became, in time, a kind of quiet warning that spread through the wider galactic community faster than any formal diplomatic channel could have carried it. Trading vessels from a dozen minor spacefaring species, docking at the handful of reconstructed human orbital stations that slowly reopened to limited galactic commerce in the years after the peace, carried the story outward in 100 different translations, each one embellishing some detail and flattening others, until the tale of the fractious, argumentative little world that had broken an 11,000-year winning streak became a kind of cautionary parable told to young officers in a dozen unrelated militaries across the spiral arm. A parable that warned in its simplest form against ever mistaking a species' internal chaos for its incapacity, because the two were not, as the Kryax had once assumed and paid so dearly to unlearn, the same thing at all. Naledi Okonkwo-Reyes, in the decades after the war, never fully returned to the Kwai. Life she had lived before the invasion, choosing instead to spend the rest of her working years training a new generation of engineers in the same decentralized, stubborn, individually driven methodology that had produced the hush. Not because any government asked her to, but because she had come to believe, in the long years of reflection the peace afforded her, that the true weapon humanity had built in that war was never really the disruptor arrays or the salvaged armor at all, but the underlying cultural habit that produced them, the simple, ordinary refusal of individual people to wait for permission before doing the thing they believed needed doing. And she spent her later years arguing, in speeches and interviews, and eventually a memoir that became required reading in military academies on 3 continents, that humanity's greatest danger in the peace that followed would be forgetting that lesson, building the kind of comfortable, centralized certainty that had doomed the Kryax Dominion to a defeat it never saw coming precisely because it had grown too confident in its own unbroken success to imagine that success might one day run out. There is in the archives of the reconstructed Human Orbital Academy that now trains officers from a dozen allied species alongside its human cadets, a single recovered fragment of Vezrach Ninth Clutch's personal log, recorded in the quiet months before the war's final year, that instructors still read aloud to new classes each cycle, not because it contains any tactical wisdom worth repeating, but because it captures, more honestly than any official Dominion record ever would, the particular vertigo of a species discovering, too late, that its own greatest strength had quietly become its greatest liability. Vezrach wrote in the careful, methodical prose of a drone who had spent 3 centuries believing that sufficient observation could always produce sufficient understanding, that he had watched humanity for 2 years before the invasion and catalogued every weapon, every fracture, every weakness his instruments could measure, and had concluded, correctly by every standard his own culture had ever used, that the species posed no meaningful threat. What he had not measured, what no instrument in the Dominion's considerable arsenal could measure, was the thing that mattered most. Not what humanity had, but what humanity would decide, moment to moment, individually and unpredictably, to do with what little it had left when everything else had been taken from it. And it was this failure of imagination, he wrote in his final entry, more than any failure of data, that had cost the Dominion a war it had never once in 11,000 years expected to lose. Human instructors, reading that passage aloud each cycle to cadets who have never known a galaxy without humanity's uneasy, hard-won place in it, tend to close the lesson the same way each time, not with triumph, because the war's cost was measured in millions of lives on both sides and no victory, however necessary, erases that weight, but with a simple, quiet reminder that the same fractious, argumentative, individually stubborn quality that broke the Kryax Dominion's 11,000-year winning streak is not a weapon humanity built and can now set aside. It is simply the species itself. And the day humanity forgets that, trades its hard-won decentralized resilience for the comfortable certainty of some new unquestioned doctrine of its own, is the day it will have finally, fully learned nothing at all from the very mistake that once nearly destroyed it, and become, in its own way, exactly the kind of civilization it was once so nearly conquered by. It became, in time, a kind of quiet warning that spread through the wider galactic community faster than any formal diplomatic channel could have carried it. A warning that any species tempted to measure humanity by its weapons, its industry, its population, or its endless internal arguments, and conclude from that measurement that humanity was somehow simple to predict or easy to conquer, would do well to remember the fate of the Kryax warbroods that had once descended on a fractured, quarrelsome, disorganized little world expecting an easy conquest, and had instead discovered at tremendous and unrecoverable cost that the very disorganization they mistook for weakness was in fact the deepest, most dangerous strength the galaxy had never learned to measure, and that the day any civilization decided humanity was known, finished, and understood was, without fail, the day that civilization had made the same fatal mistake the Kryax had made first, and paid for it in exactly the same unforgiving coin. It was a lesson the Dominion had paid 11,000 years of unbroken certainty to learn, and one that humanity, for all its scars, never once forgot how fortunate it had been to survive learning at all.